Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And this episode is going to be seen in the second half of December. So I'm going to put aside any heavy-duty politics to engage in what's become kind of a tradition here, answering just two burning questions. One, why is Christmas on December 25th as opposed to any other day of the year? And two, why is New Year's Day January 1st? As opposed to any other day of the year? Well, to answer about Christmas, about why it's on December 25th as rather than June or sometime, right at the top you have to realize something. Based on how we celebrate the season, that is, by we I mean Americans and maybe even more Europeans, based on how we engage with and celebrate the season, this is Christmas. And this, and this, and this, along with, candy canes and wreaths and mistletoe and whatever local or personal traditions you have. But this is not. All right, you know those people who say Jesus is the reason for the season? He isn't. He never was. So first, hang off on the angry emails. Let me explain. The season is because of astronomical patterns. See, until relatively recently, people were much more aware of the movement of the sun and the stars and the planets and so on than we are today, unless you're a dedicated stargazer or an astronomer. Such movements, tracking them, were signs of the changing of the seasons, of when to plant, when to reap, when seasonal rains were coming, when game would be plentiful, and so on. The sky was their almanac. Now, some of that awareness lives on in popular expressions in mythology. For example, did you ever wonder why the hot, humid days in the middle of summer are sometimes still called the dog days? Well, in the northern hemisphere, the star we call Sirius is at its highest point in the sky in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter. So ancient peoples are able to realize by their observations this also meant it would be at its highest point in the sky in the middle of the day, in the middle of summer. Now, Sirius is the brightest star in the night sky. It's in the constellation Canis Major, or the Big Dog, and it's known as the dog star. So the middle of summer become the days of the dog days. In prehistoric times, and even well into recorded history, people believed that things like the sun acted willfully or were directed by gods that acted willfully. And each year, watching it get lower and lower in the sky each day as winter approached, there was a fear that one of those years, one of those great cycles, the sun would just keep going down until it finally disappeared below the horizon, leaving the people in perpetual dark and cold. So each year when the sun stopped shrinking and started to rise again, it was reason to celebrate. This is the time of the year that is the winter solstice, the beginning of winter, which occurs in the northern hemisphere, depending upon exactly where you are, around December 21st or 22nd. Technically, we should call this the December solstice because, of course, in the southern hemisphere, this marks the beginning of summer, not the beginning of winter, but solstice is derived from two Latin words, sol and sistere, which together mean the sun stands still, which is what it appears to do at the solstice. It's getting lower and lower and lower, and then it stops and it starts climbing and higher, bringing with it the promise of the return of spring. So all over the northern hemisphere, this was the time to celebrate. China had celebrations. Egypt had celebrations, as did ancient Greek. In fact, in the earliest days, theirs involved a human sacrifice. The Druids celebrated. It was celebrated in Iran. The Native American peoples of North America, such as the Pueblo and the Hopi, they had their own celebrations. In pagan Scandinavia, the festival was called the Yule. Great Yule logs were burned. People feasted as long as the log burned, which could be like 12 days, hanging around drinking mead, listening and swapping tales of great deeds of the past. A boar was sacrificed to the chief god Odin, who donned a broad-brimmed hat and a magic blue cloak and sped around the entire world on his great white horse. Mistletoe, which was a sacred plant because it grew on the most sacred tree, which was the oak, was cut and a sprig given to each family to hang in their doorways as a sign of good luck. This is our first reminder that a lot of our holiday traditions, including the very term Yuletide, time of the Yule, are drawn from pagan ones, including decorating with garlands, wreaths, and the Christmas tree itself, along with the man who can magically fly around the entire world in the course of one night. For the date of Christmas, though, now we're moving to that area which lies between history and interpretation. While historians are confident they can date the year of the birth of Jesus within a couple of years, no one knows the day of the year Jesus was born, or even the season. To the extent the Bible can be trusted as a source, we can be confident that he was not born in the winter, because shepherds did not watch their flocks by night at that time of year. The flocks would have been corralled. In fact, watching their flocks by night was most commonly done in the spring, when the flocks were pastured and newborn lambs needed special protection against wolves. This has led some people to argue that Jesus must have been born in the spring, but this is actually a kind of a thin reed on which to build a conclusion. What's more, the earliest known use in English of the word Christmas, the Feast of Christ, Christmas, was in a list of feast days with mass days that was set down in England in 1038, 1,000 years after Jesus died. And no saint's day is listed for December 25th. Indeed, early church leaders, and I'm talking 2nd or 3rd centuries here, argued about when Jesus was born. The options included January 2nd, March 21st, March 25th, April 18th, April 19th, May 20th, May 28th, November 17th, November 20th, and yes, December 25th. And at the same time, some, such as Oregon, argued that the whole thing was pointless and wrong because it shouldn't be celebrated at all. Celebrating such birthdays, he said, was for pagan gods, not for the true Christian one. Still, by the mid-3rd century, the idea for having a day to celebrate the birth of Jesus was getting established. Nonetheless, it still took another 100 years for that notion to become formalized and a date to be set. Meanwhile, during that time, in 313, Constantine the Great issued his Edict of Milan, legally allowing Christianity in the Roman Empire. Actually, he went considerably beyond that. The edict actually says it was proper that the Christians and all others should have liberty to follow that mode of religion which to each of them appeared best, which actually shows a lot more tolerance than a lot of our right-wing so-called Christians do today. Those people who get such a great kick every year around this time of presenting themselves as the oppressed victims of atheistic socialist accords, even though Christians make up about 78% of the U.S. population. Oh, and as a sidebar, contrary to popular belief, Constantine considered himself an emperor of the Christian people, but did not actually convert to Christianity until shortly before his death in 337, and Christianity did not become the official religion of Rome for another 43 years in 380. Now, getting back to the point, the earliest known reference to Jesus being born on December 25th doesn't come until the first years of the 3rd century, about 175 years after he died. The first recorded date of his birth actually being celebrated on that day was not until 336. And it wasn't until 350 when Pope Julius I officially declared the birth of Jesus would be celebrated on the 25th of December. But that just brings us back to the start. How did the chosen date, why did the chosen date come down to December 25th? I mean, that was the question. Well, to answer that, first remember that these developments are taking place in Rome, which by then was the nerve center of organized Christianity. Which brings us in turn back to the winter solstice. The Romans, like many other ancient peoples, had their own celebrations of the solstice. In Rome, it was called Saturnalia. This was originally a feast day to the god Saturn, but over time it grew to a gigantic month-long fair and festival of the home. It began with the sacrifice of a pig and involved riotous merrymaking, feasting, and gambling. Houses were decorated with laurels and evergreens. Schools were closed, the army rested, no criminals were executed. Friends visited one another, bringing good luck gifts like fruits and cakes, candles and dolls and jewelry and incense and more. Temples were decorated with evergreens. Processions of people danced through the streets with masked or blackened faces and wearing fantastic hats. Masters feasted with slaves who supposedly could do and say what they liked. In theory. I mean, I doubt they felt free to push the privilege, since in a short time they'd be back to being just slaves, but at least hypothetically they could do what they wanted. Now notice here, by the way, again, traditions including decorating your home, laurels, visiting friends, gift-giving, holiday parties. These weren't Christian traditions. They were Roman ones, pagan ones. The old Roman goddess of the solstice was Angerona, whose festival day, logically enough for a goddess of the solstice, was December 21st. But when Mithraism, personified by the god Mithra, was introduced into Rome in the mid-2nd century, the goddess was largely supplanted in favor of Mithra's day of seasonal rebirth, which was December 25th. Mithra, himself a composite of earlier beliefs, became amalgamated with the Roman sun god called Solus Indigeni, or the native sun, a god which in turn came from the Pelagian goddess of a god of light named Helios. And Pelagian, by the way, is how the ancient Greeks referred to the people who were there before Greek culture developed. You might think of it as they're the people the ancient Greeks referred to as the ancients. Okay, this new being, this combination of Mithra and Solus Indigeni, this composite of two composites, was Sol Invictus, the invincible or unconquered sun. And the birthday of December 25th became Dies Natalis Solus Invicti, the birthday of the unconquerable sun. When the Emperor Aurelian proclaimed Mithraism to be the official religion of Rome in 274, the day became an official holiday. Okay, so put it all together. Before Constantine the Great issued his Edict of Milan in 313, being a Christian in Rome could get you killed. Refusing to participate in the imperial cult was considered treason. During the Great Persecution carried out by the Emperor Diocletian in 303 to 311, Christian buildings and the homes of Christians were torn down. Their sacred books were gathered and burned. Christians themselves were arrested and tortured. They were mutilated, burned, starved, and condemned to gladiatorial contests for the amusement of spectators. So if you wanted to celebrate the birth of the man you considered your savior, and the idea of having such a celebration was by then pretty well established in Rome, you had to hide it. So since the time is purely symbolic, so basically arbitrarily chosen because no one knows the actual date for certain, what better time to do it than during Saturnalia, when everyone else is celebrating and so no one would notice? And what better day to pick than December 25th, when the birthday of the unconquerable sun could be thought of as the birthday of the unconquerable sun. Indeed, according to St. John Chrysostom, Bishop of Constantinople, writing in the late 4th or early 5th centuries, that is just a few decades after Christianity had become the official religion of Rome, the Roman Church purposefully placed the keeping of Christmas between two popular folk festivals, Saturnalia and the Calends of January, in order to give Christians something to celebrate about while others were engaged in secular merrymaking. The Calends, by the way, was the first day of each month in the Roman calendar and is in fact the source of the word calendar. And yeah, there was a popular folk festival in Rome in the Calends of January, which is an important part of the Roman celebration of the solstice. By the year 354 CE, 4 years after Pope Julius I had designated it as such, December 25th had been accepted in Rome as the date of the Feast of Christ, or Christmas, and gradually most of the Christian church agreed. Once Christianity became the legal religion of Rome in 380, the church began appropriating what old pagan customs it could, with the result that the merry side of Saturnalia was gradually adopted and adapted to the observance of Christmas. And so that's why Christmas is on December 25th, because Christians hid within, then adopted, then adapted pagan celebrations of the winter solstice. By 1100, Christmas was the peak celebration of the entire year for pretty much all of Europe. But let me finish up by saying that even then, the idea was not universally accepted. Origen's convictions that celebrating the birth of a god was for pagans persisted among conservative Christians for centuries, including among the separatists and Puritans who celebrated Plymouth and Boston in Massachusetts. They regarded Christmas as a pagan celebration with no biblical justification. Instead of Yuletide, Puritans called it Fool's Tide, which at the very least proves that no, puns are not a recent invention. And in fact, at one point, Boston had laws banning the celebration of Christmas. Now, as an illustration of this attitude, we have the Journal of Plymouth Colony Governor William Bradford, who in the entry for 1621 recalled what he called a passage rather of mirth than of weight. Quoting him, "On the day called Christmas Day, the governor called him out to work, as was used, but most of this new company," and here he's referring to a group of people that arrived the previous month, November 1621, on a ship called Fortune. Most of this new company excused themselves and said it went against their consciences to work on that day. So the governor told them that if they made it a matter of conscience, he would excuse them until they were better informed. So he led away the rest and left them. But when they came home at noon from their work, they found them in the street at play, openly, some pitching the bar and some at stool ball and such like sports. So he went to them and took away their implements and told them that it was against his conscience that they should play in others' work. If they made the keeping of it a matter of devotion, let them keep to their houses, but there should be no gaming or reveling in the streets, since which time nothing has been attempted that way, at least openly." That last sentence, by the way, gets some added significance when you recall that Bradford was writing here about 1632, like 10 years after the fact. The outlawing of Christmas was not just here at home. In 1644, Great Britain's Puritan-dominated Parliament passed an ordinance which called for December 25th to be a day of solemn humiliation, following up in 1647 by abolishing outright the feast of Christmas, Easter, and Whitsun, the latter of which is known in the U.S. as Pentecost. The ban was not lifted until the restoration of the crown in 1660. Back in the colonies, as I already mentioned, the Mass Bay colony, that is Boston, banned celebrating Christmas altogether. That was in 1659. The ban remained in place for 22 years until 1681, and even then it was a governor appointed by the restored British monarchy that lifted the ban. And even despite that, the first recorded celebration of Christmas in Boston wasn't for another 5 years in 1686. Even for many years after that, Thanksgiving was the most important seasonal holiday in New England. In the wake of the Revolution, interest in Christmas in the former colonies faded because it was seen as a British holiday. In fact, Christmas did not again become a major holiday in the U.S. for some decades, not until a religious revival in the early 1800s spurred interest, especially in the South. As a result, it's generally agreed it was more than 50 years after the Revolution before Alabama in 1836 became the first state to make it a holiday. Even then, New England continued to lag behind. In Plymouth, the first time Christmas was even mentioned in one of the town's newspapers, as far as anyone can tell, was in 1825. As late as 1856, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote that the old Puritan feeling prevents Christmas from being a cheerful, hearty holiday. But he added, we are in a transition state, and so it proved to be, because by 1860, that same Plymouth paper, which by the way, is still being published 199 years after it was founded. That same Plymouth paper was filled with ads for Christmas presents, and by the end of the century, Christmas was as much a part of New England as it had been for the rest of the country. And for that, we're going to take a break. Okay, and now, so the natural follow-up is, why is January 1st New Year's Day? Because it wasn't always true. So why? Well, in large part, the reason has to do with the convenience of the Roman Senate, a calendar almost no one uses anymore, and the stubbornness of tradition. The earliest recorded New Year's celebrations are believed to have been in Mesopotamia about 4,000 years ago. That is about 2000 BCE. Babylonians began the year with the first new moon after the vernal equinox and greeted it with a multi-day celebration called Akitu. Now, this is actually a logical time to start the year since the vernal equinox is the first day of spring in mid-March, and spring is traditionally a time of new beginnings, of renewals, planting crops, the birth of new animals, and so on. Now, various other cultures use various days, but all of them seem to have some astronomical or astrological significance. The Egyptians, for example, use the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, which is again the brightest star in the night sky in the northern hemisphere. The heliacal rising is when a star can be seen to be rising in the east just before sunrise. Just before, that is, it's too bright for any other star to be seen other than the sun. For Sirius, this takes place in what is, by our current calendar, around mid-July. And it was important because it predicted the annual flooding of the Nile, an event so important in Egyptian agriculture. Persians use the vernal equinox, first day of fall. The Phoenicians, the first day of spring, rather. The Phoenicians use the autumnal equinox, which is the first day of fall, while the Greeks use the winter solstice, the first day of winter. Now, all these choices carried some meaning beyond the date itself. January 1st doesn't. So why January 1st? Well, an early Roman calendar designated March 1st as the first day of a new year, which actually may also resolve something you might have wondered about. If March is the first month of the year, then September is the seventh month of the year, and the Latin for seven is septem. Likewise, October, November, and December. Octo being Latin for 8, novem for 9, decem for 10. Those months were named as they were because they were the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th months of the year. Now, that early Roman calendar I was talking about was a lunar one based on the moon. Now, the problem is the average lunar month is about 29 and a half days, and there's no way you can match that to a solar year of 365 and a quarter days. And it's the solar year, not the lunar year, that drives the seasons. What's more, that lunar calendar consisted of 10 months and a 304-day year and didn't even count the days between the ends of December and the beginning of the year at the vernal equinox, which apparently was designated March 1st. Now, the calendar was reformed around 713 BCE to add the months of January and February, creating a year of 355 days, which is still 10 days off the solar year. Now, to correct this, the Romans from time to time inserted a leap month of 22 days into February, which serves to overcorrect the disparity between the calendar and the solar year, giving them some time before the error again got so big that another leap month was required. Now, next, according to general, but apparently maybe not universal, agreement on historians, in about 153 BCE, the Roman Senate moved the first day of the year from March 1st to January 1st because that was the beginning of the civil year, the time that newly elected Roman consuls began their terms in office, and it was just felt to be more convenient to have the civil year and the legal year begin on the same day. January is also a reasonable time because January was named for Janus, the Roman god of gates, doors, and beginnings. That is the god of all transitions, who had two faces so we could see past and future simultaneously. Now, despite all the repeated corrections, by the time of Julius Caesar, the calendar remained seriously out of whack with the solar year. So in 46 BCE, Caesar introduced a new solar-based calendar. This Julian calendar, as it came to be known, introduced the use of leap years to keep the calendar year from drifting too far from the solar year. Remember, the solar year is about 365 and a quarter days. So every 4 years, the calendar in the solar year diverged by a day, and that error accumulates. So it doesn't take a great many years before the difference is noticeable. Adding a day every 4 years keeps the calendar more in line with the solar year. This same calendar, by the way, this Julian calendar, came with a decree that firmly fixed January 1st as the first day of the new year. Now, after the Roman Empire fell, the generally agreed year for that being 476, and Christianity began to spread across Europe, the Catholic Church, which, remember, had previously adopted and adapted a fair part of the Mary side of Saturnalia, now felt in a position to downplay such pagan and unchristian festivals as those that had come to surround the New Year in Rome. So in 567, the Second Council of Tours banned the use of January 1st as the first day of the new year. Remember, this is at a time in European history when the authority of the church in civil matters as well as religious ones was essentially unquestioned. If the church said do it, governments did it. As a result, in the Middle Ages in Europe, the official New Year started at different times in different places. The old day of March 21st, March 25th, which is the Feast of the Annunciation and right around the vernal equinox, Easter, even though it was a different day every year, and December 25th, by then the traditional day of the birth of Jesus. But remember, Julius Caesar had set January 1st as New Year's Day in 46 BCE, which means by the time the Council of Tours acted, the practice of keeping that as the first day of the year had been going on for 613 years and was so well established that a lot of people just ignored the official date and kept to the old one. Now, the Julian calendar was also flawed because the solar year is actually a few minutes shorter than 365 days and 6 hours, so the use of leap years every 4 years slightly overcorrects the disparity. A few minutes might not seem like a lot of difference, but again, over time the error accumulates. By the latter 1500s, it had grown to 10 days. So in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII oversaw a new, more accurate calendar, which changed the rule of leap years such that only century years divisible by 400, not by 4, would be leap years, the better to prevent that overcorrection. The result was that 2000 was a leap year, but 1900 wasn't, and 2100 won't be. Now, there still is a slight overcorrection, but apparently it'll take something like 3,000 years for that to accumulate to a single day, so nobody actually cares, and we'll be using star dates by then anyway. More significantly for our story here, Pope Gregory apparently knew a losing battle when he saw one and surrendered to tradition, restoring January 1st as the official New Year's Day for the Church after 1,015 years. Catholic countries in Europe were quick to adopt the new calendar, but Protestant ones did so only gradually because they were suspicious that the Antichrist in Rome was trying to trick them into worshiping on the wrong days. Scotland, for example, took 20 years to adopt the new calendar. And England, which had used March 25th as the start of the new year, didn't finally make the change from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar until 1752. By which time the Julian calendar was 11 days off from the Gregorian, which was corrected by removing 11 days from the year. There are tales of riots breaking out with people believing their lives would be 11 days shorter or that they'd lost 11 days of wages, but historians are now of the opinion that this story of riots is a myth. On the other hand, the change of calendar was an issue in the 1754 parliamentary elections, so it's hard to credit the idea there were no protests of any kind. Anyway, that's it. January 1st is the first day of the year, not due to any special meaning or relevance of the date itself, but due to the convenience of the Roman Senate, the Julian calendar, which almost no one uses anymore, and the surrender of Pope Gregory XIII to the persistence of tradition. So in the spirit of Constantine, let me say Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Festivus. For the atheists like me and all the pagans and out there, Happy Winter Solstice. And for all of us, happy holidays and happy New Year, because like the man in the movie said, we are halfway out of the dark. So we will see you in 2 weeks. Blessed holidays to you, and as always, peace.